Hey there, guys. Alright, we are returning with Eastory, this time World War II animated, Western Front, 1940. Got nothing else? It's been a while since we watched Eastory. Let's go ahead, dive right in.
In 1939, Germany found itself in a war with Britain and France. At that time, the strength of the sides was similar, but the Allies had a significant long-term advantage and in the following years could field a much stronger army.
Yes.
Germany's only chance for victory was to defeat the Allies as soon as possible. It set out for an all-out attack. This video is sponsored by War Thunder. More on that later. For the Western campaign, the Germans had less than 3 million men in 135 divisions.
Holy shit.
France had 2,200,000 men in 104 divisions. They were supported by the British Expeditionary Force with a size of 500,000 men. This made the Allied and the German forces roughly equal. France had prepared to defend its borders. Its southern flank was covered by the Rhine River and the Vosges Hills and needed few additional defenses. Further north, the Franco-German border didn't have the benefit of natural obstacles. Here, the French had built the strongest defenses on the Maginot Line, which was held by significant forces. The mobile divisions of the French army and the British forces were on the Franco-Belgian border. They could be used to hold the northern part of the French border or to reinforce the Maginot Line or the Belgian army if Germany was to invade. The French had more tanks than the Germans, but they had dispersed many of them among their infantry and could only field 3 tank and 3 light mechanized divisions. The Germans...
That's an important distinction. The French actually also, depending on who... you can argue perhaps that German tanks were quality, but I think typically you hear that the French at this time had the better quality tanks. But obviously doctrine is extremely important in warfare, and so the Germans used their tanks much more effectively.
Had deployed their tanks in single units and had 10 tank divisions at hand. The Germans wanted to use this as the core element of their plan. At first they would invade the Low Countries. This would have the Allies to commit their forces to Belgium, so they were not able to counter the real German attack in the south. The main German tank force would move through the Ardennes region and break through at the weakest part of the French defenses, then extend the offensive towards the coast and cut off the Allied forces. In order to move into the Low Countries, Germany would have to pass through their defensive lines. Germany exploited the fact that these nations were not at war and had therefore not fully manned their defenses. They were able to launch an airborne assault and capture a section of both Dutch and Belgian lines. Now the paratroopers had to hold out until they would be reinforced by the land forces. Learning of the German invasion, the Allies now had to decide how to intervene in Belgium. They could move part of their forces into western Belgium, or they could deploy most of them in the central part of the country. They wanted to give Belgium maximum assistance and went for the latter. They also sent part of the troops to help the Netherlands, fully deploying their forces. In Belgium, the Germans were able to link up with their airborne troops. With Belgian defenses breached, the Belgian army began pulling back to central Belgium. In the north, the Germans advanced into the gap between the Belgian and the Dutch defenses and linked up with the paratroopers holding part of the Dutch line. This allowed them to move part of the tank forces behind the Dutch main line. When the Germans threatened to launch a terror bombing campaign against the Dutch cities, the Netherlands surrendered. At the same time, the tank divisions further south had overrun Luxembourg and pushed aside the Allied screening units.
Rest in peace, Luxembourg.
Soon they reached the prepared French defensive lines. The Germans launched a massive aerial bombardment. The French second-rate divisions could not withstand the attack by the best German units, and the Germans were able to breach the defenses. The French thought that the Germans wanted to outflank the main body of the Maginot Line by moving south and concentrated on that direction. Seeing that the French western flank was barely covered,
and again, you cannot entirely blame the French for thinking that. So that is a reasonable reaction to that. And another thing is that he didn't mention is that they did not think that you could really move such a significant amount of troops through the Ardennes, or if you could, they felt that they would have been notified of such movement. But the Germans were able to move. They moved fast through the Ardennes. And the main thing, they moved fast.
The German tank commanders took
that's
a risk
really
and
what
moved
screwed over the Allies
without waiting
here.
for their infantry. The Allies were surprised by the German breakthrough. But they now knew that this was the main German attack. They began redeploying their reserves to that area. At the same time, they ordered the troops in Belgium to fall back in order to put them into a better position and free up some divisions. The Allies did not know whether the Germans were moving towards Paris or the Channel coast and had to cover both directions. For that, they could use the 3 tank divisions located in the area. But the question was, where should they make the stand? The French believed that the German tanks will wait for their infantry to consolidate and therefore won't be moving very fast. As a result, they believed that they had the time to prepare defensive positions on the Oise River. The German command had indeed ordered their tanks to slow down, but the German tank commanders had ignored the orders and continued to advance.
Oh.
They moved much faster than the French had expected, and the Germans encountered the French units as they were still assembling. This caught the 1st French Armored Division off guard, and it was destroyed, while the 2nd Division was dispersed and overrun. The 4th Tank Division was not on the main axis of the German advance and was able to cover the assembly of the French troops on the Paris direction. The German tanks now needed for their infantry and supplies to catch up. As a result, the advance of the German tanks slowed down, and in the following days they were able to take only limited territory. The Allies were in the process of finishing the withdrawal in Belgium, and they were able to deploy troops to cover the Paris direction. But they hadn't had the time to put their troops between the Germans and the Channel. They decided that their best hope was to attack the German spearhead from 2 sides and encircle it. However, their light mechanized divisions were still pinned down on the front, and with 2 of their tank divisions destroyed, they lacked the sufficient strength. As a result, the Allies were only able to undertake limited counterattacks. First one was by the 4th Tank Division, but it didn't have much effect. Meanwhile, the Germans had consolidated their lines and finished the resupply. They resumed the offensive in full strength, and
Oh, there
with
they go,
little
full
Allied
speed.
troops to cover the Channel direction, they soon reached the sea. The Allies launched an attack at Arras, but it was only of limited success. The Germans turned north with the intention of capturing the Channel ports and cutting the Allies off from their supply lines. This move threatened the Allied units with outflanking, and they had to send many of the units they had gathered for the counterattack to extend the flanks north. As a result, the northern force was unable to launch the counterattack. At the same time, their forces in the south held their positions to have a chance to link up with the possible counterattack from the main French lines. The Germans ordered their units in the west of the pocket on defensive to meet the possible Allied breakout attempt. The French were deploying forces for an attack from the south, but as more of German infantry arrived to the sector, they needed more troops. But with the troops in the north without access to supply...
So, yeah, a lot of this issue... Oh, I'm not talking much. I don't really know what to say here. A lot of this seems to be... They were... Obviously, the Allies were unprepared, really, for war. And you can't entirely blame them. Even though they had been getting like a few years of notice, that was a bit crazy with annexing Austria and then annexing Sudetenland and then all of Czechoslovakia. But yeah, a lot of this is that they were just unprepared to move fast.
and being threatened with
A lot of
encirclement,
doctrinal
it was
issues
impossible to wait
and
any
French
longer.
political
Therefore,
stuff,
it was decided to evacuate the
bureaucracy
troops.
crap.
They
Think
could
happened.
attempt to break out or be pulled out by sea. As the Allies had become too weak to attempt a breakout, it was decided to pull their troops out of the ports still under their control. The Allies began the retreat to the sea. The Germans attempted to break their lines and cut off part of their forces. As the Allied forces were leaving, the Belgian army was unable to resist the Germans on its own and surrendered. The Germans were able to cut off and encircle part of the French forces. Other troops managed to hold a solid front, reach the sea, and proceeded with the evacuation. The Germans pulled most of their forces back and started to prepare for their second attack on France. More than 300,000 Allied soldiers were able to be evacuated, but all of their equipment was lost. As the Allies weren't able to replace it in time, most of these soldiers didn't take part in the next phase of the Battle of France. Now the Germans outnumbered the French. The French were holding the positions on the Somme and Eun rivers. However, the Germans had established several bridgeheads which weakened the defense. To overcome that, the French could pull the main forces back to the next river line around Paris, but they decided against it. The French wanted to use the defensive advantage provided by the rivers in northern France to inflict significant casualties on the advancing German army in the hope that it would run out of steam. In order to do that, the French needed to avoid the breakthrough by the German tanks at all costs. The Germans did not want to give France any time to recover, and as soon as part of their forces got ready, they attacked. At first, the French plan worked, and they were able to fall back in an organized manner, but soon the first breakthrough
Then chaos happened, yep.
The German tanks broke through the French lines and reached the river Seine. The French were able to destroy the breaches and block their advance. But the German tanks now moved towards the sea and cut off part of the Allied forces. By then, the other part of the German forces had joined the attack. The French were able to slowly pull back, but eventually the German tanks were able to break through. The French troops west of Paris had been encircled and destroyed, and as a result, the Germans were able to cross the Seine unopposed, and the French lacked the troops to contain them. The French command was afraid that now their troops were going to be encircled, and ordered them to break contact with the Germans and move further south to make a stand on the Loire River. The defense of Paris was abandoned, but the withdrawal broke the cohesion of the French armies, and the German tanks were able to fully break through into the French rear. Germany wanted not to allow the French forces to escape and attempted to cut off and destroy as much of them as possible.
Yep.
With most of the French army moving on foot, the tanks could easily outmaneuver them. They pushed deep into the French rear, and many of the French units were caught or bypassed and dispersed. With most of the French army in the west in retreat, the largest portion of intact French forces were behind the Maginot Line.
Oh, and they're about to be
They had pulled
completely
a lot of
surrounded.
the forces off from line into field divisions, which could pose a threat to Germans. The Germans set out to destroy them. They attempted to overwhelm the French defenders by attack from all directions. Their main force would move in from the west, while the tanks outflanked the line from the south. At the same time, they launched attacks through the weakened line from north and east. Meanwhile, the French had reached
This
the
is so
Loire River
deep.
in
This is far
force
more detailed than
and
I was
attempted to
expecting.
make a stand. However, they were
Oh.
unable to cover all the crossings, and on the same day, the pursuing German forces crossed the river. The French continued the retreat. At the same time, the German tanks overran the
So what I like about this video is a lot of the time you hear about the French surrendering really fast, and you don't get this, this context of just how fucking destroyed they are getting, right? You hear like, oh, Paris fell and boom, the French surrendered. Obviously, that's not the case. That's not what happened. And, they fought, they tried to hold on, but French doctrine and German doctrine, the differences and the way the Germans used their advantages over how the French used theirs, completely different.
French forces
I think I
retreating
explained that
in the
alright.
north. The French in the east were unable to form a solid front against the German offensive from several directions, and the Germans were able to encircle them and push them into a small pocket, making them surrender. Only a small part of
Like, look how much of France is under German occupation right now, and they still haven't surrendered.
the
Like,
French
yeah,
forces was able to survive the retreat, and the odds had become too unfavorable to continue the war. Although the French were successfully resisting attempts by Italy to cross the Alps, they were unable to resist Germany. They agreed to German terms and signed the Armistice, which would come into effect 2 days later. There were several reasons why France lost the campaign, but lacking good tanks was not one of them. While the
alright. That was World War II animated Western Front, 1940, by Eastory. Got the name for a second. I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.